White as snow, red as blood. Chapter 8. The sight of Snow White's return made Queen Astrid nauseous. However, she supposed it was her own fault. She hadn't thought the plan all the way through, and it was brewed in the middle of the night after she drank too much. The only positive was that Queen Astrid was in the clear. No one suspected her of intentionally trying to harm the girl, and according to Natty, Snow and Nathaniel had a pleasant time without any incident. Queen Astrid knew she needed time to devise a plan that wouldn't be traced back to her. So, she left Snow and Rose alone for the remainder of the week, asking Elijah to keep the girls busy. Meanwhile, she ensured her sons had little time to visit them. It wasn't a strange amount of work, seeing as Richard was the crown prince and Nathaniel had years of schooling to catch up on. Yet, she couldn't stop the boys entirely from seeking Rose and Snow. One night, Rose and Snow were working late in the herb garden. As they carefully uprooted and replanted, Rose questioned Snow again about her day with Nathaniel. Snow had been quiet on the matter, driving Rose insane. "Come on, when are you going to tell me the details?" "It's just us out here for once," Rose pleaded. Snow didn't budge. Ever since she returned from her outing with Nathaniel, she felt so many eyes on her, and rumors were circulating around the grounds. There was now an expectation that she and Nathaniel would be getting married. The same could be said of Rose and Richard, but it wasn't nearly as intense because they hadn't spent much time together since the ball. "I told you we watched the sunrise and went ice skating." Rose heaved a sigh. "Yes, but how did you feel about the experience? What did you talk about? Did you hold hands?" "I need details, Snow." "It was nice." "Yes, we occasionally held hands and talked about the view from the tower." "Snow," Rose growled, realizing her sister was being honest while still keeping the matter tucked away. Suddenly, they heard the metal gate shriek in a high pitch. They spun around and spotted Nathaniel pushing Richard into the garden. The princes were bickering quietly but ceased their argument once they saw they had an audience. Richard coughed and stood straighter, adjusting his tunic, which Nathaniel had wrinkled. "Oh, good evening, Rose Red and Snow White. We were just out for a stroll to stretch our legs and Nathaniel wrapped an arm around his brother's neck, trying to make the stiff prince loosen up. "See the beautiful flowers in the garden." Rose stood and clapped the dirt off her hands. "If you're thinking about stealing my sister away, you better answer a simple question for me." Snow hurriedly ran forward, stepping between Nathaniel and Rose. She didn't know what Nathaniel would say, but she knew it would be embarrassing. "He'll tell you the same thing, Rose. So just let it go, okay?" Rose smiled broadly and then took a guess, carefully whispering her theory. "I see, so little Snow had her first kiss." Snow and Nathaniel both blushed. Richard clicked his tongue in disapproval, but Nathaniel was quick to defend himself before his brother could lecture him. "Hey, we had a chaperone, and it was brief. I was a perfect gentleman. Besides, let's not forget who stayed overnight at their house." Richard rolled his eyes. "You did that too, remember? As a bear cub." Richard opened his mouth to say something else, but Rose placed a bucket full of medical herbs in his arms. "Okay, if you insist on being here, you might as well help me bring these inside." "We're not leaving them alone," Richard protested. Rose tugged on Richard's sleeve while she sang. "Oh, yes, we are." Begrudgingly, he left Snow and Nathaniel, glancing back briefly to see what his brother would do. He was satisfied when he saw Nathaniel pick up a small garden shovel while Snow walked around to the other side of the garden box. Richard turned his eyes forward, entering the court herbalist building with Rose ahead of him. She directed him to a back room where they kept all their supplies. Then she got out a mortar and pestle. As soon as Richard set the bucket down, she placed a handful of the herbs into the mortar and began to grind them. Richard watched in fascination as she worked. After a few minutes, Rose asked, "So, maybe I shouldn't ask this, but when exactly do you ascend the throne? It just seems strange to me that you haven't already." Richard scratched the back of his head. "Ah, yes. I'm sure many people have asked themselves that question. Well, I'm old enough, but my father wanted me to be married first." Rose turned back to her work. But didn't your father marry your mother much later in his life?" "That's correct, but my mother was his second wife. He divorced the first because she couldn't have any children." "Ah, so it comes back to having an heir." "That poor woman. Didn't he love her at all?" Richard shrugged, pulling out another mortar and pestle, and copied Rose's movements. "I can't say for sure. He rarely spoke about his first wife, probably because it would upset Mother. I know he cherished Mother, yet it's hard to tell if their relationship was the ideal love." "How about your parents?" Rose instantly smiled, and Richard liked how her beam glowed in the candlelight. "They undoubtedly loved each other. My mother was a fairy, and my father a human. They met each other while studying medicine. My mother's family wasn't impressed, so they cut ties with her when my father and mother married. Every once in a while, I would see her cry because she missed them, especially when my father passed, but she always told me she didn't regret her choice. She liked life without magic and loved the home father built for us." "Sounds rough, but I'd like that kind of life too. However, being the heir to the throne makes that impossible." Rose smirked, side-eyeing him. "Well, you could, but something tells me you'd last a week before you felt guilty." Richard sighed, his muscles slacking. He knew she was right. His mother and father had always expected great things from him, but he expected greater things from himself. "And how do you figure that?" "For starters, you're clearly a family and duty-orientated person. I mean, you dropped everything when I told you about a friendly bear, instantly knowing it was your brother. Then, you just generally strike me as someone who overthinks and reevaluates everything they do." Richard shifted, not liking how easily Rose pinned him down. Her tone was so nonchalant that he worried everyone could see through him. He laughed shakily before continuing to grind the herbs into a paste. "I feel exposed. I guess I'm meant to settle for whoever comes along. No dramatic romances here." Rose hummed and pulled out a set of vials to pour the paste into. "I wouldn't be so down. There are plenty of kings who have married for love. I think the main thing is finding someone who respects your responsibilities and is willing to support you. And there's nothing wrong with being an open book. Honesty is a refreshing trait." A knot tightened in his chest. Rose noticed his silence and peered over at him, noticing how he glanced at a set of medicine bottles on the top shelf. She waited patiently for him to respond. She set her work down once he faced her. "Sorry, I hate when people refer to me like that because we've kept what happened to Nathaniel a secret. But also..." Another glance at the bottles. Rose waited still, knowing he'd finish. He wasn't the only one affected by the wizard's enchantment. "I also transformed into a wild beast. But we found a way to contain it, so I remained human. That's the real reason I visited Chief Elijah the day I ran into you." He breathed. "Now that the wizard's gone, I shouldn't have to worry about that anymore. I might as well add that it was another reason I'm not king yet." Rose touched his arm gently and said, "And yet, you continue to be forthcoming anyway." "Thank you." She then winked. "Now, what secret would you like me to share in return?" Richard gulped, a question popping into his mind as soon as she asked, but he desperately tried to mentally kick it out. We don't need to exchange secrets. I told you that because I thought you might as well know, seeing you already knew about Nathaniel. Rose Red laughed, returning to her work after she brushed a loose strand behind her ear. Oh please, just ask me anything. I don't care what the topic is. I just like talking, all right? The young prince faced the work table, and the question slipped out of his mouth. Fine then. Since you got so excited over Snow's first kiss, it got me wondering if you, that is to say, if you've been kissed. Yep. Back when I was 15, at a village festival. I thought I was in love and that we would get married. That is until this guy got engaged to someone else. Of course, I was overreacting back then because our kiss was more like a peck than anything else, and we danced a total of 2 dances. Then, when I was 17, I formed a legitimate relationship that I quickly ended after he tried cozying up to my sister. It made my blood boil that he was flirting with her while I was present, but what really got me was how uncomfortable Snow was. I haven't been interested in anyone since then. Well, at least not enough to consider kissing them. Richard nodded, getting far more information than he wanted. Though, he did feel a bit relieved to know she wasn't pining after an old love. But then, upon further reflection, his heart drooped as he comprehended her last 2 sentences. She said she wasn't interested in anyone, which would include him, right? So, Nathaniel and I are deemed unkissable by Rose Red, he coughed, doing his best to play it off as a joke. Rose frowned and then considered what she had said to give him that impression. She clicked her tongue, having her fill of dancing around on her tiptoes just because he was a prince. This is stupid, she whispered so quietly that Richard didn't catch it. He turned and leaned in. What was that? She smacked the pestle on the table. The medicine. Don't cough on it. Richard attempted to apologize and return to his natural standing position, but Rose caught him by the neck and planted a kiss on his lips without shame. The prince almost knocked his forehead into hers, but he stabilized a hand against the table as he was forced to lean down further than he had been. He had given brief kisses to various women his mother set him up with, but none had so boldly kissed him like Rose Red. Once he got over his shock, he lifted his other hand and placed it on her waist while he kissed her back. He was just getting comfortable when they heard Snow and Nathaniel enter the building. Rose instantly backed away, letting go of his neck and returning to work. Meanwhile, his heart hammered away as he stared at her in a daze. When Snow and Nathaniel entered the room, Rose glanced at Richard and rolled her eyes. Don't help if you're just going to cough into the medicine. She turned to Nathaniel, crossing her arms. Can you please take the crown prince back to his paperwork? You can frolic in the gardens with Snow during daylight hours. Nathaniel groaned, looking wearily at his brother for ruining his plan. The whole reason he dragged Richard down to the gardens wasn't just so he could have a chaperone to see Snow but so Richard could romance Rose. He assumed his brother had failed terribly when, in reality, his plan had succeeded beyond what he pictured. Was he really that unhelpful? And Mother's got us busy the entire day. It was a miracle we were able to sneak off tonight. Rose waved a hand dismissively. Then that means there's work you left unfinished. Nathaniel wasn't too happy, but he obeyed Rose as if she was his mother. He grabbed the speechless Richard by the shoulders and left through the back door while taking one last glance at Snow. Once the 2 men were gone, Snow tilted her head and studied her sister thoughtfully. Rose was, indeed, covering up her explosion of feelings, but something bothered her the longer she thought about it. With her chin and eyes, she directed her sister's attention to the unlabeled medicine bottles on the top shelf. Did Chief Elijah ever tell you what was in those vials? She asked. Snow's attention drifted to the bottles, and she shook her head. I don't believe so. Why do you ask? Rose walked around the work table and slid the attached rolling ladder closer to the medicine bottles. She walked up the steps and took one of the vials off the shelf, popping it open and looking inside. The dark, chunky liquid looked about as nasty as most of the other remedies they prepared, but Rose couldn't pick any particular scent out to identify what was in it. Apparently, Richard was cursed along with his brother, but he was able to stay human. By drinking that? Snow speculated. Rose nodded before handing the vial to her sister. Tell me what you make of it. Snow studied the mixture. While both girls were proficient at creating medicines, Snow had always been gifted in identifying what ingredients were used in a concoction. It was how they replicated most of the medicines their mother and father made. Well, there is something different about it. Snow concluded, rotating the vial to get a better look. There were flakes of purple inside, which she swore glowed faintly. If I were to take a wild guess, it has to be imbued with magic. Otherwise, I don't see how it would stop a wizard's enchantment. Which would mean Chief Elijah is a wizard or at least got help from one. But if Richard's curse is broken, why would he still need these? Unless they made a surplus. Snow carefully examined the bottom of the bottle where Elijah typically dated his brews. There was nothing to note when the potion was created. There's no date, so I have no idea. But does it really matter? Rose sighed, grabbing the bottle from her sister and placing it back on the shelf. Perhaps not. Richard is cured, and Elijah being a wizard is hardly concerning. Most kingdoms have wizards studying medicine nowadays. Snow helped her sister down, and they quietly finished their work. However, their heads buzzed with doubts and questions they still had. For Snow, she wondered why the cure to a bear enchantment would include wolf's bane, while Rose questioned the stockpile created for one person. Ultimately, they both reasoned their way through, deciding they must be mistaken.